The studio lights were hotter than usual, or at least that's how it felt when Willie Nelson leaned back in his chair, braiding a strand of silver hair between his fingers, and smiled that slow, knowing smile that had disarmed interviewers for decades. The View set hummed with its usual morning energy, camera operators gliding on silent tracks, producers whispering countdowns into headsets, the audience primed for applause at the flick of a cue card. Joy Behar sat forward, elbows near the table, already mid-thought, her words spilling quickly as if she were racing the clock. She had been on a roll all morning, cracking jokes, steering conversations, cutting in with practiced ease. Willie, invited to talk about music, life, and his latest reflections on America, had barely finished one sentence before Joy jumped in again, reframing his answer into something sharper, more confrontational. At first, it felt like banter, the kind of back-and-forth daytime television thrives on. Joy teased him about his laid-back style, joking that his calmness must come from all that time on the road doing whatever you feel like. Laughter rippled through the audience. Willie chuckled too, nodding politely, trying to respond. But each time he opened his mouth, Joy interrupted, correcting him, challenging his phrasing, turning his personal stories into punchlines. The other co-hosts exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift from playful to pointed. One tried to redirect the conversation toward his music, another chimed in with a softer question, but Joy kept circling back, her tone tightening, her jokes edged with impatience. Willie spoke about growing up poor, about learning early that people don't all see the world the same way, and about how music taught him to listen before reacting. Joy waved a hand dismissively and quipped that, listening is overrated when people are wrong. The audience laughed again, but this time it was thinner, more uncertain. Willie paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, then the hosts, then finally settling back on Joy. He didn't bristle, he didn't snap, he simply waited, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed. That pause, subtle as it was, shifted something in the room. Even the cameras seemed to linger a fraction longer on his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. He talked about living long enough to see trends rise and fall, arguments repeat themselves under new names, and how humility was the one thing time never made obsolete. Joy smirked and leaned back, firing off a joke about old-school wisdom being code for refusing to change. Willie smiled again, but this time there was a hint of sadness in it, as if he'd heard the line 100 times before. He tried to answer, to explain that growth didn't always mean shouting louder, but Joy cut him off once more, her words tumbling out fast, sharper than before. That's when she crossed the line without quite realizing it. In an attempt to land one more laugh, she made a crack about his age, about how easy it must be to preach patience when you've already lived your life and don't have to deal with today's mess. The audience reaction was immediate and split, some laughter, some murmurs, a few audible gasps. Willie's smile faded, not into anger, but into something firmer. He straightened slightly in his chair, hands resting calmly on his knees, and looked directly at her. The studio seemed to shrink, every sound dropping away except the faint hum of the lights. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her back. He simply said, "Respect don't expire with time, honey." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they landed with the force of a hammer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause erupted, loud and sustained, rolling through the studio like a wave. Some audience members stood without even realizing they were doing it. Joy's expression froze mid-smile, her eyes widening just enough to reveal she hadn't expected that response, or the reaction that followed. She tried to laugh it off, tossing her hair and making a comment about people being too sensitive, but her timing was off now. The rhythm she usually controlled had slipped from her grasp. Willie continued, still calm, explaining that disagreement didn't have to mean disrespect, that listening was an act of strength, not surrender. Each sentence drew more nods, more applause. Joy attempted to interject again, but her words were drowned out by clapping. For perhaps the first time in her long television career, she was being talked over, and not by another host, but by the audience itself. The co-hosts sat stiffly, unsure whether to step in or let the moment play out. One of them offered a nervous smile, another glanced toward the producer's table, silently asking whether to cut to commercial early. The director hesitated, sensing that something raw and unscripted was unfolding, exactly the kind of television that couldn't be manufactured. Joy leaned forward again, her voice sharper now, accusing Willie of turning the segment into a lecture. He didn't bite, He simply shrugged slightly and said that conversations only felt like lectures when one side refused to hear the other. That line drew another burst of applause, louder than the last. Joy's face flushed red, her jaw tightening. She shuffled her notes, knocked her pen against the table, and muttered something under her breath that the microphones thankfully didn't catch. The balance of power had shifted completely. Willie wasn't dominating the room by force, he was doing it by refusing to play the game she had mastered. The more she pushed, the calmer he became, and the contrast made her look increasingly rattled. As the segment neared its end, the tension was impossible to ignore. Joy forced a smile and tried to wrap things up, but her usual closing quip fell flat. The audience applause was polite at best, and all eyes kept drifting back to Willie, who tipped his head slightly in acknowledgement, as if to thank them for listening. The cameras cut to commercial, but the atmosphere in the studio was anything but relaxed. What had started as a routine daytime interview had turned into something deeply uncomfortable and unforgettable. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio erupted into a low, chaotic buzz. Applause signs dimmed, stage managers hurried across the floor, and producers leaned in close to their headsets, voices tight with urgency. Joy pushed her chair back sharply, the legs scraping against the floor louder than necessary. She stood, shaking her head, her lips pressed into a thin line as she muttered about being ambushed on her own damn show. A producer approached with hands raised in a calming gesture, but Joy waved him off, pacing just behind the table, her movements quick and restless. Willie remained seated, relaxed as ever, chatting quietly with one of the co-hosts. He seemed almost untouched by the tension, as if the storm swirling around him belonged to another room entirely. He thanked the host for the invitation, joked softly about live television always having a mind of its own, and took a sip of water. That calm only seemed to agitate Joy more. She spun back toward the table and accused the producers of letting the audience turn the segment into a circus. The producer tried to explain that the reaction wasn't planned, that moments like these were unpredictable, but Joy wasn't listening. Her voice rose, sharp and clipped, echoing just enough for nearby crew members to hear. When the 5-second warning flashed, Joy returned to her seat, jaw clenched, eyes forward. The red light on the camera blinked back on, and the show resumed with forced smiles and brittle politeness. Joy folded her arms, barely looking at Willie as another company host tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground. It lasted less than a minute. Joy interrupted again, this time not with a joke but with an accusation. She said she wouldn't sit quietly while someone talked down to her, especially when she'd spent years fighting to have her voice heard. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this wasn't part of the script. Willie listened, nodding slowly, then replied with the same steady tone he'd used all morning. He said no one was trying to silence her, that disagreement didn't erase her experience, and that respect wasn't a competition. That should have diffused the moment, but instead it seemed to snap something inside Joy. She laughed harshly and said she was done being polite, done being the one expected to smile through condescension. Her words came faster now, tumbling over each other, anger bleeding through the humor that usually shielded it. Then, abruptly, she stopped. She looked out at the audience, at the faces watching her intently, some sympathetic, some disappointed. She glanced at her co-hosts, none of whom met her eyes. For a split second, vulnerability flickered across her face, quickly replaced by defiance. She pushed her chair back again, this time with finality, and stood. "I'm not doing this," she said into her microphone. "I won't be humiliated on a show I helped build." Gasps rippled through the studio. Before anyone could stop her, she unclipped her mic and walked off the set, disappearing behind the curtains as the cameras struggled to decide where to focus. The show limped through the rest of the segment without her, the remaining hosts visibly shaken as they tried to fill the silence she left behind. Willie offered a few gracious words, saying he hoped everyone could keep talking to one another, even when it was uncomfortable. He thanked the audience again, tipped his hat, and exited the stage to warm applause. But the real drama had already escaped the studio, spilling onto social media before the hour was even over. Clips of the exchange spread at lightning speed. The quote, "Respect don't expire with time, honey," was everywhere, plastered across headlines, memes, and comment threads. Some praised Willie for his composure, calling it a masterclass in dignity. Others defended Joy, arguing she'd been cornered, that years of being outspoken had finally caught up with her in a moment that felt deeply personal. By the afternoon, entertainment news shows were running the footage on a loop, dissecting every glance, every pause, every word. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was tense. Executives huddled in closed-door meetings while publicists drafted statements and revised them again and again. Joy didn't return to the set that day. By evening, reports began to leak that she'd walked out not just on the episode, but on the show entirely. Insiders whispered that she felt betrayed, that the moment with Willie had crystallized a long-simmering frustration, feeling unheard, outnumbered, and increasingly out of step with a changing audience. When the official announcement came, it was brief and carefully worded. Joy Behar, it said, had decided to step away from The View, effective immediately. There were no details, no acknowledgement of the argument, just a vague nod to new chapters and time for reflection. The public read between the lines anyway. Supporters mourned the end of an era, recalling Joy's sharp wit and fearless commentary. Critics argued that the show had finally reached a breaking point, that the argument with Willie Nelson had exposed cracks that could no longer be patched over with jokes. Willie, for his part, declined to fan the flames. In a short statement, he said he held no ill will, that conversations were meant to challenge people, not destroy them. He wished Joy well and hoped the moment would encourage more listening and less shouting. The restraint only added to the contrast between them, deepening the impression that the clash had been less about winning an argument and more about two philosophies colliding under unforgiving studio lights. Days later, the studio looked the same, but it felt different. An empty chair at the table spoke louder than any commentary. The audience applause was cautious, the laughter more measured. And somewhere beyond the cameras, the echo of that quiet, devastating sentence still lingered, a reminder that sometimes the most humiliating moments aren't delivered with anger, but with calm, unwavering clarity.